into their presentations and discussion. So the roundtable will discuss the overlapping crises and conflicts in Sudan from an interdisciplinary perspective. In late 2018, what became known as the December Revolution attracted broad segments of the population into a mass civil disobedience against the ruling government, eventually deposing President Omar al-Bashir in April 2019. Since then, the major focus has been on the war between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces in what has alternatively been called the civil war, proxy war, or counter-revolutionary war. The roundtable participants will shed light on aspects of the Sudan conflict not visible in the international media that reflect ongoing struggles, not just against authoritarianism and military rule, but also against agrarian injustice, economic exploitation, land grabs, repression of women, and structural racism. Hopefully, cover some of this. And I just briefly before I was sort of asking the question of how does one refer to this conflict, war, saying also genocide, Darfur, and so on. So that's also something to think about. Our speakers, two of which are with us, and Mizan Neil is online, unfortunately, could not make it. So I'll present them in order of their presentation. Bayan Abu Bakr is a PhD candidate at Yale University History. Her research centers trans-Saharan histories of slavery, and circuits of capital in the formation of 19th century Arabism and blackness in the Afro-Arab world. Bayan's research, I'm not going to list all the fundings that she's received, but I'll present just a few of them. It was funded by the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition, the American Research Institute in Turkey, and the Social Science Research Council's International Dissertation Research Fellowship, with funds by the Harvard Foundation. Next, we have Hamid Falafallah, who's currently pursuing a PhD degree at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester, researching democratic transitions and grassroots movements in Africa. And over the years, he's worked for various international and national organizations in Sudan on governance and development issues. Last but not least, on Zoom, we have Mizan Neil, who's a research fellow at the Transnational Institute, an engineer, researcher, and public speaker. She's the managing director and the founding member of the Sinad Center in Sudan, which is a research center that works in the field of innovation, science, and technology for people-centered development. Mizan has over 10 years of engineering experience in the private sector, managing projects in FMCG, which I'm not sure what that stands for, startups, and relevant technical consultancy. So with that, I'm going to hand over the stage and the mic to Bayan to start us off. Thank you.
Thanks so much, hi, everybody. 10 minutes. Okay, cool. I'm going to actually put a timer so I can, who knows if I'll follow it, but yeah. So, yeah, hi, everybody. My name is Bayan. I want to first thank the Arab Council for Social Sciences for hosting this really important conversation. I'm really honored to be honest with you, with all of you. Hamid and Muzan, a lot of my own ideas are formulated by thinking through all of your important writings these past few years, so it's really nice to be thinking alongside you guys. I hope next time, inshallah, Muzan, you can be here with us. I want to preface this panel by just grounding it in the reality of the war. The war in Sudan has gone on for 2 years and counting now, actually 2 years, 1 month and 2 days. 15 million people have been displaced, both internally and externally. 150,000 people have been killed, although this is a highly underestimated number, and 30 million people are facing acute hunger. Both the SAF and the RSF commit human rights violations and are responsible for this war. The institution of the Sudanese military has always been disposed towards sacrificing civilians for its own territorial ambitions, and this war is a symptom of that. This is a centralized government that has been at war with its internal frontiers in the western southern and mostly rural parts of Sudan for most of its existence, between 50 to 55 years out of its 69 years. So I'm a PhD candidate of history at Yale, and as Samuel mentioned, my work is about the trade of enslaved peoples and the networks of capital that facilitated it in Ottoman Egyptian Sudan from roughly around 1840 to 1924. I don't want to spend too much time talking about my own research, but I would like to offer some lessons from the 19th century that I found valuable for the inculcation of critical thinking about the counter-revolutionary war in Sudan that is presently taking place. So my title of the presentation is Lessons from 19th Century Ottoman Egyptian Sudan, and the map of Ottoman Egyptian Sudan from 1805 to 1914 is up there for reference. If we can go to the next slide. So this is a map of the trans-Saharan caravan trade in the 19th century. This map is taken from Ismail Montana's book on slavery in Ottoman Tunisia, titled The Abolition of Slavery in Ottoman Tunisia. So the major road that connected Sudan to the trade was the 40 Days Road from Darfur to Asyut. From Sudan, the sale of enslaved peoples, ivory, ostrich feathers, and gum arabic dominated the trade. The trade of enslaved peoples became a vast accumulation-oriented corporate enterprise in the 19th century. This took place, of course, after Sudan's incorporation in the Ottoman Empire vis-a-vis Mehmed Ali Pasha's conquest in Sudan in 1821. He took over Sudan, primarily because he sought to eliminate a potential Mamluk threat in Dongola. These were Mamluks who had escaped the 1811 massacre, committed genocide. This was after Mehmed Ali's attempts to eliminate the former ruling class. The second was to find oft-rumored gold that was said to exist in Sudan. And the third was to acquire enslaved peoples from Sudan to build his modern army known as the Nizam al-Jadid. So ultimately, Mehmed Ali Pasha's expansionist projects along the Nile Valley and the Red Sea, which included Eritrea, Somalia, and included the Khalid Ismail projects later in the 19th century, helped to unequally incorporate Sudan in the burgeoning world system of capitalism through its more corporate interaction with Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, and trans-Saharan caravan trade routes. The Ottoman period, I argue, is an important. So I'm just reading a bit fast. So the Ottoman period, I argue, is a really important one, although it's often ignored, because the private property and tax regime instituted by the Ottoman Egyptian government created a class of landless merchants that came to procure enslaved peoples along Sudan's historic slave-raiding frontiers in the west and the south to build militarized armies that would secure their access to trading routes and protect the capital they owned. Perhaps the most notorious of these traders, being Zubek Pasha, who was the first person to conquer the Sultanate of Darfur in 1874. So I share this map of the trans-Saharan caravan trade to ground us in the complex and multi-layered geographies of the trade of enslaved people in the 19th century. My work looks at European and Egyptian travelers' records written in the 19th century, Ottoman and British imperial sources, as well as letters of sales and purchase exchanged between local Sudanese land-owning and non-land-owning merchants and traders of enslaved peoples to examine the points of conjuncture in which these actors interacted, which I locate in the trade of enslaved peoples in the 19th century. My work argues that the competition over slavery was a competition fundamentally over Sudan, as it guaranteed the monopolization of violence, land, and the labor which toiled it. This competition for Sudan informed European and Ottoman-led abolitionist campaigns and a series of merchant bourgeoisie-led revolutions in the second half of the 19th century, which I argue culminated with the Methodist Revolt. So, this framing that I've put forward, I think, forces us to step outside of assumed geographies that separate the global, regional, and local scales and the actors that make up these geographies, and build out an understanding of these actors through the material interests and relationships that bind them to one another. I argue fundamentally that this geography, or these corporate geographies, are including a matrix of power and violence that includes a lot of actors and cuts through many different geographies of the region, a lot of which are often assumed and which are built on fantasies created by the Western imperial view of the world. These have informed some of the false binaries that have ignored Sudan's deep enmeshment in a system of global layered relationships. If we think about Sudan's modern history, especially where it fits in the popular imaginary, it has constantly been defined by limited binaries such as Arab versus African, Christian, or Muslim, North, South, etc., which ignore how interior relations cut across these binaries. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is a map taken from Sudan War Monitor, published on March 12th, 2025. I know it's very difficult to say, but it shows some of the regional and local alignments in the current war. There are currently over 20 paramilitaries that are part of the Sudanese military. For a significant part of its history, the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, have functioned like a Frankenstein-like institution made of different militarized groups who use violence to politically participate in the state. The military has externalized its own legitimacy and authority to this group so that they can maintain control of regions outside of the center, most of them being rural areas. If I had to add anything to this map, it would be the flow of weapons and mercenaries as part of a global transnational network of violence. Just recently, actually, France 24 released a really incredible report on the use of Colombian mercenaries to smuggle weapons in UAE purchased from Bulgaria from the International Golden Group, a UAE firm run by Mohammed Ka'bi to Libya, Chad, and eventually to the RSF in Sudan. The International Golden Group, which I just mentioned, has different deals with the US, UK, and France. So even in this one instance, this report came out after, this mercenary went viral on Twitter for, the question was raised, why is a Colombian mercenary in the western part of Sudan? This one instance of violence shows this, global transnational network that includes so many different actors, ultimately goes back to the US and UK and France. So ultimately, I argue that this focus on corporate geographies, I think, allows us to more fully think through the orbits of power that are surrounding and really suffocating Sudan presently. This geography can help us understand how the United Arab Emirates, Israel, Egypt, the Western/imperial world, the global military state-industrial complex, the NGO development complex, Sudanese power brokers and the local bourgeoisie, those who just possess communities over the rights to land, all operate together and apart, sometimes in contradictory ways, but always in a way that truly reveals how much Sudan is a site of conjecture for so many different groups and networks of power and violence across the world. I think that this framing should also inform the nomenclature we use to describe the war. It's for the reasons that I've outlined, but I think calling it a civil war ignores the material history of the origins of SAF and the RSF. The reality being that the RSF developed out of the incorporation of a paramilitary force known as the Devils on Horseback, or the Janjaweed, who were emboldened by SAF in the 90s and especially in the early 2000s. The proxy war framing, of course, allows us to see, this wider context in which Sudan fundamentally existed through the relationships I mentioned earlier. But we, of course, should not let our use of this term insinuate that local actors in Sudan are not operating within the context of their own agency and their material interests. There is a very specific story about Sudan that is unique to it, but allows us to refract into our understanding of the world at large. Both can be true at the same time, I argue. And I just want to conclude by saying, I hope that this framework shows how this is a fundamentally a counter, or it helps us develop a language at least, that can articulate how this is fundamentally a counter-revolutionary war, driven by the interests of the global elites and the states, militaries, and institutions which represent them. With that being said, I'll pass it on to Hamid to take us. And if we can just leave this map up for reference, and maybe turn the brightness up if it's possible, but yeah.
Thank you so much, Bayan, and thank you all for being here today. Very pleased to be speaking to you. And I think what Bayan has very beautifully articulated kind of lays the foundation for a lot of what I'm going to say. And I'm going to actually elaborate a bit more on where she ended about seeing this war in Sudan as a counter-revolutionary war. War in Sudan is not necessarily a new phenomenon. There's been a gap in analysis and the discourse on Sudan, particularly on the global level, but also on the regional level, has always been problematic, falls into these binaries that they have mentioned. And in the current war, there is this binary of everyone trying to figure out, which one is the less evil, is it the armed support forces or is it the armed forces? Do you support this one? That one, and that's a very problematic way of discussing the war in Sudan. That is not productive. That is not helpful to anyone. And without, having the nuance and the ability to understand the complexity of the situation and how, as playing different roles and so on, and have shared interests in many cases, we would not be able to fully understand the war in Sudan and also produce solutions that might be useful. And we have, particularly as Sudanese people who have been, for the past 2 years, we've been pushed to kind of choose a side in many ways, and there's this question that is always present there, like, but okay, but what about the Rapid forces? What about staff and so on? Which in many ways feels like this very problematic question that keeps on get posed by Western media reporters and so on to related to the war on Gaza on whether you condemn Hamas. So it feels a lot similar to that, which does not help anyone. But anyway, I think I would like to go back to the title of the roundtable, which is Sudan in the context of polycrisis, which is indeed a very fitting title because the situation in Sudan is a case of compounded and intertwined crises that feed into each other. With the figures that Bayan already mentioned and so on, Sudan is experiencing the world's largest displacement and hunger crisis, and the multiplicity of crises which are unfolding in a context where there are no frameworks or options for civilian protection whatsoever, has made Sudan evidently the world's worst humanitarian crisis in recent history. So in addition also to this, to the multiplicity of crises, there's an array of complex narratives and angles through which we can analyze and define the war in Sudan. Yet I argue that we can only fully comprehend the war by understanding all these dynamics collectively and see and appreciate how they interact with each other. And as also like Ben mentioned, like there's the civil war kind of narrative, there's a power struggle narrative, there's a civil war narrative, and so on. But these frameworks are not necessarily useful on their own. So while there are two military factions fighting to rule the country, it is not merely that. So the internal power struggle framework alone does not suffice. Indeed, there are elements of intercommunal conflict manifesting in many parts of the country, yet it is definitely not a civil war. Also, there is a very strong direct intervention from foreign actors and so on, but also indirect through their local agents. But still, the proxy war framework does not explain the full picture. So it is indeed a very multidimensional war where multiple realities that can often be contradictory coexist in the same context, and we need to understand that. However, there is a cross-cutting theme that emerges through these different narratives, which is the counter-revolutionary and anti-democratic aspect of the war in Sudan. The war can be traced back to decades or even centuries, as Ben demonstrated in Sudan's history, but it's also deeply rooted in Sudan's most recent history. By examining the literature of the revolutionary groups in Sudan, the December Revolution and so on, one can see how the revolution of the Sudanese people in December 2018 did not only aim to overthrow the regime of Omar al-Bashir, but fundamentally attempted to dismantle the material and conceptual structures of the Sudanese post-colonial state, which is essentially a predatory, centralized state which was captured by elites, both armed and unarmed, and continued to protect and sustain their interests, but also the interests of external actors who shared also these interests in many ways with those armed and unarmed elites, while at the same time marginalizing and oppressing a wide range of Sudanese citizens. The war in Sudan today is a continuation of an anti-democratic and counter-revolutionary campaign that started first by co-opting the revolution in 2019 and then was further cemented by the military coup in 2021, which was jointly orchestrated by the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces, who are ironically fighting today. As such, derailing the Sudanese revolution in December 2018 was indeed the pathway to war in April. It is evident how this war, which is one that's against civilians in general, has shown concerning patterns of relentless and systemic attacks on pro-democracy actors and grassroots groups that led the revolution share a vested interest in suppressing Sudan's democratic movement. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the details of how these attacks on pro-democracy actors manifest and how they interplay throughout the country. But these attacks have been persistent throughout the past 2 years of war in Sudan, and we can see them in every part of Sudan with each of the warring factions attacking these groups differently. And often these attacks get masked and justified with a vague accusation of being collaborators, where each warring faction accuses the pro-democracy grassroots groups of being supporters and collaborators with the opposing warring faction. Also, this anti-democratic aspect of the war exhibits in how oppressive authoritarian tendencies are getting entrenched in all parts of the country, whether under the control of the Sudanese armed forces or the rapid support forces. And as we see in the map that Bayan displayed last, there's the country is experiencing a de facto partition where the rapid support forces have control over one part of the country, and the Sudanese armed forces are having control over the other part of the country. But what's happening is that both of them are establishing authoritarian, or attempting to establish authoritarian states in the territories under their control. And ultimately, an essential part of this project is annihilating the legacy of Sudan's revolution and its advocates and eradicating the space for civil politics. And while the ongoing attacks on pro-democracy grassroots movements by the armed actors are way more violent, this is not the first attempt to silence them. And there are other actors as well who have been doing this by using different tactics, obviously, but it also leads to the same results in many ways. Before the war erupted in 2023, the international community, and by the international community here, I'm speaking about Western powers that claim to be, supporting democracy, human rights, and so on. Obviously, we have seen how all that proves to mean nothing in many contexts. But even in the context of Sudan, they continue to sideline the pro-democracy grassroots movement while insisting to mostly work with armed and non-armed elite groups in ways that recognize these elites as the only legitimate political actors in Sudan, while undermining the grassroots groups and their struggle for rights. In fact, one could argue that that problematic engagement of the international community, which of course was intentional, we can get probably in the discussion later of why it was intentional, has contributed to legitimizing the political ambitions of armed actors, the leaders of SAF and the leaders of RSF, which in many ways paved the way for the war that we are seeing today. And now that I alluded to the question of legitimacy, I can speak to my experience as a Sudanese citizen throughout the revolution and subsequent military coup and the ongoing war. It was these grassroots groups, pro-democracy grassroots groups, that mainly I would name the neighborhood resistance committees that provided me with a space to organize, to mobilize, a platform to voice my political views, while also facilitating access to services in the complete absence of state, as well as providing support after the war broke out, and also helping me flee to safety. And I think Susan in her presentation will speak a lot more about these grassroots groups' roles that they play and the initiatives and so on. But this is not also like only my individual experience. This is being widely reported by Sudanese people on the ground on who were the actors that supported them and who are the actors that are with them on the ground. And that kind of shows us very vividly who has legitimacy on the ground and who should be represented and who should be offered a seat at the table. And the existence and popularity of these grassroots groups is indeed a reflection of a new political and democratic imaginary in Sudan. Unfortunately, the problematic engagement of the international community still continues in the way they think about mediation initiatives and peacemaking efforts, which is largely centered around the warring factions, and sometimes they include some elite political groups. And while this blueprint is particularly harmful and futile in the Sudanese context, it has also repeatedly failed globally, as it keeps rewarding violence and determines that carrying arms is the cost of admission to have CWA. A formula that only reproduces cycles of violence and conflict and authoritarian. And just to conclude, I think it is essential to appreciate the underlying counter-revolutionary nature of Sudan war at the heart of our analysis, and to recognize the role of pro-democracy grassroots groups, not merely as casualties of the ongoing war, but as indispensable architects of the imaginary of a post-war Sudan.
Hello, I hope you can hear me. And also that in a second you'll be able to see my presentation. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to join the roundtable. So in the next few minutes, I will like to explore with you the topic of civilian strategies at the face of the war, the 2023 war in Sudan, which is the currently ongoing war, and civilian strategies or how unarmed, how the unarmed working and middle class are responding to the war and impacting it as well. This is a topic that gets limited media coverage and is also understudied in research. And that is true not just for Sudan, it is a universal situation. The gap in the media is basically the flip side of the media's focus on battles, shift in territorial control, summits, and negotiations and statements of officials, which are basically all the actions of the ruling class and its bureaucracy, the actions of the elite, whether armed or non-armed. And the media generally focuses on that, leaving basically no space for the actions of those outside the ruling class. And the same is true for research, unfortunately. Like research, especially for areas under conflict, it focuses on security issues. So, the actions of the armed, macroeconomics, the actions of the civilian elite or the unarmed elite, and international interventions, which are the actions of the international elite, basically. And this gap in research, in my opinion, stems from two factors. The first is the elitist academic frameworks that are not only incapable of prioritizing working class interests and actions, but they often fail to even acknowledge or see them, let alone to study them. And the second factor is that the political and economic agendas of the governments and institutions that fund research, which steers studies towards their interests that might be, the extraction of resources from war-torn regions and so on. So this gap and the lack of interest in civilian strategies must be understood as part or as a tool of an elitist political project. So trying to shed a light on this gap, which strips away basically the agency of civilians outside the ruling class, we will be looking today on strategies of civilians in Sudan in two aspects. First, service provision, and then productive economic activities, and both during the war, of course. So let's start with service provision. The first picture you see here is a Facebook post 8 days after the start of the April 2023 war. This is the emergency room in the neighborhood of Umbed al-Sabil in the capital, Khartoum. They're announcing their work on maintenance of the health center to be able to provide services to the residents in the neighborhood, which was besieged by the war at the time. Mind you that this is a maintenance that the elitist government did not do even before the war, but this mutual aid initiative is doing during the conflict. The second two pictures are from this week, actually. Those are emergency rooms in two different areas in the state of North Darfur. The first is initiating an emergency education program here, distributing supplies to children in a state where regular education have been suspended for over a year by now. And the second of another room's central kitchen, they're feeding IDPs, internal displaced persons. And the emergency rooms are structures of mutual aid that appeared since the very early days of the war, as you saw, some of them on the first day of the war, on the 15th of April, 2023. They were supported by the vast organizational experience and knowledge that the Sudanese public accumulated, working in resistance committees since 2019, or even watching and interacting with resistance committees. Some of the rooms even used the platforms of the resistance committees to announce themselves. And they were also supported by small donation funding from the Sudanese and from the diaspora and so on. The types of services that they provided evolved basically in direct response to the needs of their community, from health to education, shelter, feeding, maintenance of utilities like the electrical network, and many other services. And this structure showed impressive resilience and responsiveness and efficiency, especially in comparison to both the state apparatus and the international model, international aid model. However, they do remain challenged by this emergency framework, which is limiting them from evolving into a sustainable and permanent bottom-up governance system. There is, of course, also the issue of the sustainability of funding. But I would argue that to find solutions for sustainable funding, we must first switch to a sustainable framework and perspective, not an emergency firefighting one. Nevertheless, the emergency rooms are still working and providing invaluable lessons in people-centered provision, people-centered service provision. So let's now talk about civilian strategies in terms of productive economic activities, a topic that is even less studied, honestly, than service provision. We see here in a photo from last week, the first photo. It is from one of the farms of the agriculture emergency rooms, which were recently created in Darfur in the last 6 months, maybe. And these farms were created by civilians from the area who worked with their communities to organize farming, to adjust the crop basket, basically to respond to a situation of siege and an expected famine that North Darfur is living under. And they looked for funding from international NGOs, and they received it. It was then disconnected due to the USAID cut, and due to that, they reorganized their finances, and they were able to continue the project without external funding, and had a successful harvest in 80% of the farms or more. And the second photo is from the first year of the war. It is from a home workshop for the production of soap in Khartoum, the capital. Micro manufacturing of these essential goods, it spread throughout Sudan after April 2023. The war started in the center and the capital of Sudan, which is a country that had a very centralized development model. So we had 70% of the manufacturing facilities or the large-scale manufacturing facilities in the country. They were all in the capital and the neighboring state of Jazeera. Those two states where they became conflict areas within 8 months. And accordingly, since all these large-scale facilities were no longer operating, micro-scale manufacturing started to cover the gap. They started with dairy products. They were previously monopolized by Sudan's largest private sector conglomerate and produced in one factory in the capital for the entire country. So people took over this market, but they didn't stop at dairy. As we've seen here, there was micro scale of soap. There were leather products, beauty products, packaging material, coal, metal sheet fabrication, and many more. And we are seeing it across the country, also geographically. So what we're seeing is that manufacturers are bringing modernization and job opportunities in areas where the government didn't reach for decades, actually. So there is a lot to explore and learn and discuss from the strategies of civilians, whether in production or service provision. I would say there's actually a lot to learn and discuss in this single photo of an emergency room in North Darfur providing the daily children's meal. However, for now, there are some key points from these brief comments that I would like to summarize, and I hope we take with us, which is first is that the strategies implemented by civilians in Sudan in terms of service provision and in terms of service provision as well as productive economic activities are providing efficient, people-centered and innovative, building blocks for state building and industrial development. Second is that achieving the true potential of the civilian-led and controlled strategies requires breaking away from the emergency mindset to one that is more long-term and sustainable solutions. And finally, that there is a real need for research that explores civilian strategies as well as inform them. And to facilitate their development. Basically, for us to take research to the people that are working and maybe break away from the idea of research to inform policymakers, because policymakers are not lacking information. They have different political balance that is shaping their decisions, while people are lacking information to realize political projects that are clearly very people-centered, very progressive and socialist in essence when we look at these services that they provide. Yeah, thank you. That's all from my side.
Okay, so we have about an hour for conversation. I rather not, monopolize. We could talk later, so I'd like to open it up to questions. I do have some questions, but I'll reserve them if there aren't enough. And then I think we'll need to pass the microphone.
Sorry, if I may ask if you can keep just the mic a bit close because the sound is a bit muffled at my side.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would like to speak by Arabic. أولا نشكر الشباب السودانيين بيان والأخوة أيضا لتقديم هذا العرض الجميل الذي عرف بواقع الحرب في السودان بتفصيلات مختلفة. لدي بعض التعليقات والأسئلة حول ما في الأوراق الثلاثة. يعني أشعرت إنه الأوراق أو البحوث تجاه الأدوار تقوم بها الحكومة المدنية الموجودة حاليا مثل دور وزارة الصحة السودانية. واعترف بهذا الدور منظمة الصحة العالمية ومديرها العام الذي زار بورت السودان العاصمة المؤقتة قبل عدة أشهر، وأكد أن وزارة الصحة رغم التدمير الممنهج للمستشفيات والمراكز الصحية استطاعت أن تقوم بدور كبير في معالجة المرضى والمحتاجين بشكل كبير رغم الإمكانيات البسيطة. وهناك دعم من حتى منظمات عربية مثل الهلال الأحمر القطري، منظمات من الكويت ومن مصر وغيرها. هذا الدور ما كان يجب أن يظهر حتى لو كان لم يكن هناك دور للمستشفيات التي تم تدميرها في كثير من الأحيان، وبعضها بعد أن تم تدمير وتهجير الطاقم الطبي أعيدت له الحياة من جديد. خاصة في نوع مثل مستشفى الكلو مشهور ومعروف وقام بأدوار كبيرة، أيضا مستشفيات في مناطق أخرى. أيضا في موضوع الزراعة، الحديث عن المجاعة في السودان هو حديث يحتاج إلى بعض التقدير، لأن القوات العامة الزراعية قامت بتدمير هيئة البحوث الزراعية السودانية التي تقوم بتوفير البذور المحسنة وتقوم بتوفير أعمال جيدة في هذا الجانب، ولها أبحاث لها أكثر من 100 عام. كل هذا الإرث البحثي تم تدميره تماما بواسطة القوات العامة الزراعية حينما سيطرت على ولاية الجزيرة، وتم نهب المخزونات الضخمة من البذور والمحاصيل. هذا هو الذي قد يؤدي إلى ظهور شكل المجاعة. لكن هناك ولايات أخرى مداخمة مثل ولاية القضارف وولاية سيناء دعمت هذا الجانب بما عندها من المخزونات. لذلك الحديث عن المجاعة يحتاج إلى تقدير علمي وتوضيح، لأنه إلى الآن هناك جيوب فيها مجاعة، لكن أن نقول أن المجاعة منتشرة في السودان هذا يحتاج إلى مراجعة. الحديث عنه الحكومة المدنية غائبة، هذا الأمر واضح وموجود في مناطق مثل أم درمان وتقدم خدمات للمواطنين، مثل خدمات التعليم. هناك مدارس في المناطق الآمنة في كل أنحاء السودان، 70% من السودان الان هو مناطق امنه، شرق السودان، شمال السودان، ومناطق وسط السودان، حتى العاصمه الان بعد عوده الجيش وفرض قوات الدعم السريع فتحت المدارس واقيمت امتحانات الشهاده الثانويه السودانيه وامتحانات الشهاده المتوسطه في كثير من المناطق، فاذا يعني الى حد ما موضوع التعليم هو في المناطق التي يسيطر عليها الدعم السريع غير غايب وغير موجود. ويعني اعترف ايضا الشباب، شباب ميدان المقاومه، شباب غرف الطوارئ قاموا بادوار جيده في مجال التعليم بعون المنظمات المختلفه، لكن ايضا الحكومه المدنيه اخر نقطه انه يعني مثلا الان الحكومه المدنيه الموجوده في العاصمه الاداريه في السودان يعني بها السفارات الاجنبيه، كثير من المؤسسات قائمه وتقوم بادوار الدوله رغم الاشكالات الموجوده. فاتوقع انه الان بعد عوده العاصمه الى القوات المسلحه قد تنتقل الحكومه الى الخرطوم وتحاول ان تعيد الحياه الى العاصمه المدمره تماما. بدات السفارات ايضا تعود الى العاصمه وتستلم مقراتها، فاتوقع انه خلال الفتره القادمه بعون التدريبين السوداني كان الدول العربيه شقيقه او منظمات اجنبيه يمكن ان تعود الحياه بعد الحرب وتستأنف الحياه بشكل طبيعي. شكرا.
خلينا بس نختصر يعني نكون السؤال. So just make sure your question is not too long, short introduction to your question.
So my name is Hamza Hamouchan. I'm from Transnational Institute. Thanks for all the speakers for their insightful interventions. I have two questions. The first one relates to the tendencies and the contradictions in terms of framing the struggles that can the various struggles, not just in Sudan, that can be a true minefield. And I'm speaking specifically about two tendencies. The first one is the tendency to hierarchize struggles and suffering rather than see them as interlinked at various levels. And then the other tendencies of the what about it. So when you speak about Palestine, to undermine that, say, what about Sudan? If you speak about Sudan, what about DRC? So I just want to know from you, how do you navigate that? And specifically, has written an excellent contribution for the Transnational Institute. The title is Failing Palestine by Failing the Sudanese Revolution. You can say more. The second question for Diane is if you can elaborate on those global networks of militarism, intervention, securitization that is happening in terms of looking at the role of Israel and the UAE in Sudan. And that actually confirms that the struggles are interlinked. Israel is committing genocide, intervening in other parts, but the UAE is also playing very negative in the region and in East Africa.
Take maybe one more question.
طيب شكرا على المداخلات القيمة. أنا استوقفت ملاحظتين. أول شيء من ميزان، أول شيء على أعطائنا لمحة أو قدرة المجتمع على إعادة الإنتاج نفسه بأشكال تعاونية في تقوية السلطة وأيضا ظروف أساسية جدا. وهذا أعتقد أن هذه الأساس مقارنة خاصة في المؤتمر الذي تكلم عن الدمار والخراب والخيال، لأن هناك أيضا جانب يتعلق بالخراب اللي هو ماذا يعمل المجتمع؟ ليس فقط ماذا يحدد المجتمع، كيف يلقي المجتمع، كيف المجتمع له دور فاعل. النقطة الثانية استوقفتني في قلب التحديد هي كيف الدولة السودانية والمقاومة السودانية والمركزية والتي تسمح لقوى مختلفة بالاستيلاء عليها. ليس فقط ما تشير ولكن قدر كبير. وهذه طبعا يعني نظرة على كثير من الدول من المقاومة الكولونيالية في المنطقة وبعض المنطقة الثالثة. وهذا يعني الطرح أعتقد أنه يطرح علينا مسألة كيفية التفكير في تراث انتفاضة 2019 2018 2019. أيضا يعني ما هي تصورنا لمستقبل الدولة السودانية مثلا، وكيف يمكننا تركيب ما بعد الثورة اللي هي مرتبة بشكل يصعب الاستيلاء عليه. هذا كمان ينطبق على دول ثانية يعني سوريا مثلا. إنه كيف نتخلص من التراث الاستعماري ليس فقط من خلال إنهاء الاستعمار، لكن أيضا من خلال إنهاء الدولة ما بعد الاستعمار. لا يمكن الاستيلاء على أي فرصة، هذه إشكالية قديمة.
بعد سؤال No.
Anyway, sorry.
You asked for the one.
Thank you so much for these presentations. I've been following SUDAN since the eruption of 2002 in particular. It was very inspiring. And I have a few questions. I'm Egyptian, so I know that our reality is very different from Sudan's, and Muslim always likes to say that the Egyptians only have like one revolution, and Sudan they have many revolutions and has the composition is a bit different. But there were two things that I wanted to ask in particular. One is, I thought that when we call it civil war, I think this is naive, but then it will help us rather focus on the locus of it instead of this idea of the imperialist wars, or something, as opposed to say, kind of, this has been also a debate, like a long debate, and has a long history, how to call it. So, in terms of how you want to, I understand that you want to go away from civil war because you feel it takes away from understanding it within the global context and capitalist system. So, I kind of did something there. But it's not really, like, on the other hand, I feel calling it only counter-revolutionary war, which was your suggestion, kind of also, like, why would you feel that this is better? Like, do you think that this has more focus on the revolution and hence bring out what has been happening in terms of struggle and resistance and so on, as opposed to calling it civil war and hence just focusing on the support force and the local struggle? So maybe if you can clarify that, that would be really great. And just one question to Morgan. I've been searching for you Morgan for 2 days now with other colleagues, and now we finally see you online. It is really very unfortunate that you could not come. But I just wanted to ask also if what you have presented, does this relate in any way to the local committees that have been forming, and you've been following it very closely since 2019? In light of the revolution, or are these now again like kind of new initiatives that's been kind of unfolding within this dynamic? Thank you so much.
If it's okay, I'll try to answer all of these questions or different elements of all of these questions because I think they speak to some of the threads of sort of territorial expansion projects, both SAF and RSF. Civilians are punished. Food aid is prevented from being sent to either region to punish civilians and to make sure they're starved and essentially kill them. But at the same time, what's interesting is that the livestock trade in Sudan has only increased and become more profitable since the war began. I don't remember the exact figure, but significantly since 2022. And it's interesting because RSF, livestock from RSF-held areas is actually able to descend to SAF-held areas, like to Port Sudan and then to the Gulf. So it's interesting how their corporate interests are maintained despite this, this huge difference between them in like how they're able to punish civilians for being affiliated with either side, but in many ways they continue to work with each other. At the same time, the UAE is always seen as the sort of the benefactor of the RSF, but in reality, both the RSF and SAF send from gold mines to the UAE. This has been going on since 2019, between 2019 and 2021. So to answer your last question about, calling it a civil war, it's interesting with Sudan. I feel like there's a difficulty in explaining where Sudan fits because I think it represents so many contradictions of the modern world. It is, fundamentally a transnational sort of interaction between different corporate interests. And I think I don't think there really is one way to call this war. I think we'll have clarity on that 20, 30 years after this war hopefully ends. But I think fundamentally, to me, I understand it as a counter-revolutionary war that's driven by the interests of the global elite and the states and the militaries and the institutions which represent them. So I think it cuts across the local, it cuts across the regional, and it cuts across the imperial and the global to connect these actors to one another. So I think if we, had an accurate map of all these different interactions, it would extend far beyond the nation state, and we probably wouldn't even see the borders of the nation state at all. And so in many ways, I think there's lessons to be learned in thinking about this war as a sign of conjuncture for all of these states to interact with these states, these corporations, these militaries to interact with each other, rather than an event that is just happening to Sudan and Sudan. In many ways, you can think about it as like a sort of global world war. To answer the question about the UAE and the sort of hierarchy of struggles, I want to really ground this Sudan as like part of like the UAE sort of expansionist project in Africa, which has rapidly been increasing. I'm very horrified by, the UAE is the fourth largest foreign direct investor in Africa, after the US, the EU, and China. It's invested in ports that encircle Africa, that serve both the UAE's military ambitions, which is tied to the militarization of different groups on the continent, and their goal to acquire land and extract resources on the continent. So yeah, the UAE has sent weapons and other military technology through their access to trade routes and networks in the Sahel region. I think that map I showed of the trans-Saharan caravan trade, we can't say these are the exact routes that the UAE uses, but this historical network is also, it is tied to a modern day phenomenon. So this is facilitated by their port operator logistics company, Abu Dhabi Ports Group and Dubai Ports World, that enables the UAE's power grabs along the African Red Sea. The UAE's intervention, as I said earlier, is part of, intervention in Sudan is part of its larger imperial campaign. The UAE is nation building, it's empire building, and it's ripping pages out of the playbook of 19th century colonialism and treating Africa as a disposable reservoir of resources, and African people and African land as exploitable and disposable. The deals they strike with these authoritarian regimes encompass plans designed to develop the urban landscape of them and make cities more revolution-proof, as can be seen with the UAE's business elites investments in Cairo, which I think are a very horrifying example of this. The UAE has supported the Great Genocide through its enabling of the Ethiopian government, and was the first country in the Arab world to recognize Israel as a state in 20 years. The UAE and Saudi intervened in Bahrain to suppress protests and together launched one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes in Yemen. And the UAE fundamentally fears real democratic, popular revolutionary movements erupting in the region, and it always has, because any sort of shift on the popular front in the region could threaten their hold on power. And so I think, to conclude, this really sort of gets to this hierarchization of struggle, which I'm really grateful you cited Muslim's article, because it helped me clarify my understanding of this so much. I think, framing these conflicts as opposing one another, as requiring more attention than one another, or pitting them against each other in the attention economy, really ignores that this is about dispossessing people from their land and extracting resources. And the UAE is what the US, all of their enablers are directly invested in this project. And there's so many linkages that connect Sudan, Ukraine, Palestine, all to one another. The Wagner Group being one that heavily relied on the oil that was coming on Sudan to rampage Ukraine. We could talk more and more about the transnational connections that bind all of these struggles to one another, but that's a whole other panel, so I'll pass it on.
Thank you. I will also try to run through questions as quick as possible, and I will respond to questions in Arabic and بالنسبه للسؤال حول الحكومه المدنيه في السودان، انا ما عارف لاي درجه ممكن نستخدمها لانهم هي حكومه امر واقع. المفروض نتذكر انه الحرب قامت في واقع بتاع انقلاب عسكري، فما في حكومه شرعيه في السودان من قبل الحرب، وده بالتالي بيخلي انه ما في حاله حكومه شرعيه بعد الحرب. فدي حكومه امر واقع باي حال من الاحوال، حكومه بتاعت الجيش السوداني، ما حكومه مدنيه على اي حال من الاحوال. وإن كان فيها جانب مدني بنشوف إنه كيف الجيش السوداني بيعيد تمكين نظام عمر البشير الأسقف الثورة السودانية عبر الحكومة المدنية الحالية. ففي سؤال بتاع شرعية كبير جدا موجه للحكومة ذات الأمر الواقع في السودان. صحيح بتقوم بأدوار مختلفة عبر وزارة الصحة ومؤسسات مختلفة بمؤسسات الواقع دي وكده، لكن الادوار دي والخدمات بيتم تقديمها بطريقه زبائنيه بتشبه الطريقه اللي كان بيشتغل بها نظام البشير، بحيث انه بتزيد الولاء لها والدعم الشعبي على تقديم خدمات معينه، حرمان مواطنين ثانيين من هذه الخدمات على اساس عنصري في اغلب الاحوال. يعني مثلا حتى المستشفيات اللي تم ادارتها وتم اعاده تشغيلها في الجرمان وغيرها اغلبها تمت بادوار اهليه تحديدا ما بادوار الحكومه. لكن برضه في امثله كثيره لكيف ان الحكومه بتاعت الامر الواقع مثلا بتمنع وصول المساعدات الانسانيه للمواطنين في اماكن مختلفه، وبرضه كيف بتمنع خدمات عن المواطنين. يعني مثلا في الاسابيع الماضيه كان في قسم نموذج بتاع ريزيلينس كيف، لكن بتاع الصمود والقدره على مواجهه الصعاب، انه في طائره سودانيه كانت بتسافر 2000 كيلومتر من منطقه اللي هي عايشه فيها اللي هي تحت سيطره الدعم السريع عشان تمشي منطقه تحت سيطره الجيش السوداني عشان تمتحن امتحانات الشهاده لدخول الجامعه، واخذت رابع اكبر درجه على مستوى السودان. لكن كانت بتسافر 2000 كيلومتر لانه الحكومه بتاعت الجيش حرمت المواطنين في مناطق الدعم السريع من الجلوس لامتحان الشهاده القومي. فصعب نعاين للدوله كأنها دوله بتقدم خدمات للمواطنين. وفي نفس الوقت بتستهدف كل الجهود الاهليه اللي بتساعد المواطنين باعتقال شباب لجان المقاومه وشباب غرف الطوارئ بصوره دائمه باستهدافهم عن طريق القتل او الاعتقال. في قوائم بتاعت اسماء بيتم مداولتها اغلبها فيها اسماء الشباب اللي في غرف الطوارئ وبيتم تصفيتهم بصوره مباشره. فصعب يعني نشوف الدوله السودانيه الحاليه بتاعت الجيش كدوله بتقدم خدمات. Then to the tendencies of يعني the hierarchy of suffering, I think just to be very bluntly, we live in a racist world that likes to tends to kind of categorize and puts us in hierarchies according to our skin tone and our and so on. Meanwhile, deliberately forgetting and intentionally kind of moving away from the fact that there is room for all of our struggles to be represented and on their own as valid, causes, but also collectively as Bayan mentioned, intertwined struggles in so many ways. بالنسبة للسؤال حول مستقبل الدولة السودانية بعد الحرب وكيف الحفاظ على السؤال بوجه السودان لكن بوجه سوريا وغيرها من المناطق. أفتكر في الواقع السوداني تحديدا الإجابة على السؤال ده بتبدأ بأنه نبدأ نتعامل مع القوى الموجودة على الأرض بصورة مختلفة، بصورة بتدي الأولوية وبتدي الصوت للقوى اللي بتمثل ما بس ثورة ديسمبر لكن بتمثل الواقع السوداني على الأرض وبتبعد من إعادة إنتاج العمليات السياسية اللي بتركز على الإليت على النخبة السودانية حامل الأسلحة وغير حامل السلاح وغير حامل للسلاح. One last answer to the question of why not call it a civil war that helps us kind of focus on the internal dynamics and so on. I think the fundamental problem with that is calling it a civil war suggests that civilians on the ground have stake at this war. Meanwhile, it's a war against civilians in the first place. No civilians on the ground have any interest in this war. They do not benefit from it in any way. Obviously, there's a war economy that is now thriving, and that's kind of incentivizing some civilians to be part of it, and some can have benefit out of this war. But that's a different conversation. But fundamentally, no civilians want this war to happen. So it's not the civil war; it does not have these roots to it. In the same way, for instance, the intercommunal kind of fighting and conflict in some parts of Darfur was kind of manipulated by the state in 2003. So it was a civil war, but then it was also kind of manipulated by the state in many ways. But today's war is quite different. There are some civil war aspects to it in Darfur and other parts of the country, but the bigger picture has nothing to do with that. And it kind of, in many ways, portrays the warring factions, the rapid support forces, and the Sudanese armed forces as legitimate actors who are fighting on behalf of people during that is not necessarily the case. And the counter-revolutionary kind of focus is only a reflection of the intentions of both wave factions and what they fundamentally want out of school.
Would you like to jump on?
Yeah, I think just because the sound wasn't always very clear, I think there were two questions that were specifically directed to me, and then there are other points I would like to also contribute to. So just to make sure I got the questions right, there was a question about how the current like emergency rooms and mutual aid initiatives and so on are linked to the revolution or should be understood as a new innovation, and also a question about the قدرة المجتمع على إعادة بناء نفسه عبر الإشكال التعاونية تحت الأنظمة العسكرية and the challenges of that. I think I got some words if I got them right. So yeah, okay. So I would come to those questions, but I would also like to contribute to other like points brought up, although my colleagues have gave like good and valid responses to them, and I appreciate that. But just add then. So, for example, for the issue of how the contribution of the current government, you know, and the SAF government in Sudan, and how it should be understood. You know, a couple of days ago, we got photos from our grandma's home in Old Umdurman, in the capital, and the areas surrounding it. And you know, my sisters and I were thinking about how we should inform people. There was this wall in a school next to us, and the wall was totally demolished, and the school looked totally, you know, destroyed. And we were like, we should somehow inform people that this wall was already destroyed before the war started, before we even left. Like, it was destroyed by the rain finally a year before the war, never maintained, but it was seeing destruction for years before that, and that is something we saw. And sometimes the neighborhoods tried to fix it, but you know, it kept getting worse and worse. And that is true for the entirety of what we see coming from Sudan. There is so much destruction that was there before April 2023, and of course we cannot ignore how much worse, you know, exponentially worse it did get in the past 2 years, specifically in areas that didn't see direct conflict before. And that is the main thing, is how do we gauge the destruction? How do we gauge the impact of a certain decision-making entity, the government or an armed faction or otherwise? Do we gauge it by how international organizations are, what kind of evaluations they are given it when they are meeting ministers in their air-conditioned rooms, or do we gauge it by its impact on the daily lives of people? Do we gauge the impact of the agricultural bank by its financial records, or do we gauge its impact by the continuous delays in funding that caused farmers over decades to lose more and more of their lands, and enriched exporters of crops who use the farmers' need to even lower their prices even more? Or do we gauge it by the privatization? Do we gauge the destruction of the agriculture sector in Sudan by how buildings were destroyed during the war, or by how those buildings such as facilities such as the seed bank have been privatized since 30 years ago, and then people lost access to what they were supposed to provide to the farmers as part of the larger privatization model that we've been going under. So that's the point. Who do you center? Do you center the people, or do you center what is it called, sovereign facilities and so on? And I would say when we center the people, we see that there are different forms of crime. Some are more bureaucratic and organized, some are more chaotic, that have been inflicted on the Sudanese people by SAF, RSF, previous elitist governments, and then they can be seen as part of, it's just using different tools to inflict the same kind of impoverishment and extortion of resources from the Sudanese people. The new thing is that this conflicts, these kind of extortions and related conflicts have came to the previously safe urban centers. And that created a new situation, some of it material because of the centralized economy, which means when you hit it at the center, you hit everywhere in the country, and some of it political, related to now we have the middle class directly impacted by the wars and how then they behave in a different ways. And this brings me to the point that Hamza and Bayan, I think Hamza and Bayan, yeah, discussed on the and also Hamid about the contradictions when in framing the war in Sudan. And I would say that those are the contradictions of the middle class. What we hear from Sudan, we hear it from the middle class and the ruling class. We do not have tools to hear how the most impoverished of the Sudanese people, where their politics or where their interest is. We do not have the tools. The tool for that was a revolutionary party, of course, that brings up those voices, but that did not exist in Sudan for decades. And as much as the points about racism and why conflicts in Africa do not get attention, because there is this perception that Africa is a place of conflict, but the same is also true internally within Sudan, right? Like how the wars in the periphery do not get as much attention because the periphery, Darfur or the south or otherwise, are the places of conflict. But now that it came to the capital, it came to the urban centers, it's such a big deal. And it's constantly repeated that we are seeing unprecedented crimes where they were precedented by the same actors in the same country not a long time ago. But it is where we look. But the issue of racism is there, okay, but the issue of racism was also there when it was 2019, and we did have the attention of the world. There was a consistent narrative from those whose voices we hear from Sudan. There was a consistent narrative from the middle class. We want to bring down this government because this government is doing this and this to us, and we want a new civilian government and so on. Right now, the narrative of the middle class is messy. It's a lesser evil narrative. This narrative does not fall. It has too many contradictions, and that creates the contradictions in advocacy for Sudan and in solidarity with Sudan. And the only way we can do it, we can change that, is by bringing the mic back to the people most impacted, not the middle class. On the issue, finally, I'm getting to the question, sorry for that, but the issue on the ability of the community of rebuilding itself on collaborative models under military regimes. The hardest thing that these models are facing is that they do not see themselves as part of a political project, which make them basically a prey for more clearer and stronger and more organized political projects, including the political project of the army that is now dismantling those collaborative forms, as Hamid mentioned, by detentions and ending the work of emergency rooms and all of that. There is still some room for those emergency rooms and mutual aid initiatives to start building an anti-authoritarian narrative, because they slipped on that, and try to galvanize communal support around them to protect those initiatives. But this window is closing so fast, and we need to seriously work on it. And that's why I said there is need for research to inform the sustainability of mutual aid and collaborative models. And finally, if those models are linked to the revolution or a new innovation, there are, of course, a lot of new innovations in them, and their focus on service provision and production and not just political rights is on its own very, very, very an evolved stage of what we had in the emergency rooms, or since the 2019 revolutionary uprising up until the April 2023. However, they do build on a lot of the basic organizational capacity, even of the values. Especially if we go to the early days, we would see that the statements of announcing an emergency room would always carry a revolutionary narrative of that this emergency room is created because the state and the elite have chosen to put their resources in fighting over power. So now we have to come up with the resources to serve our people. We've lost this again over time to a far extent, again due to the lack of a clear voice of a revolutionary party, and people got into compromising with the different warring parties, and then what we're seeing now is that the authoritarian propaganda that even counts these initiatives sometimes as خونة, متعاونين, like collaborators with the enemy. That is spreading, unfortunately. So there's a lot of work to be done and very little time on that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go have one more round of maybe 3 or 4 questions.
أنا مصطفى صغير من الصعود المصري. سعيد بالأول كأس المهمة سريعا. لأن أنا فرحت مبسوط جدا بالخريطة، وأعتقد ده كان فهمي. هل يمكن حضرتك أصلا تقصدي العلاقات التاريخية ما بين تاريخ العبودية الموجودة ربطها بالوضع الحالي أو في خلال أزمة دارفور خلال الأوقات السابقة، وربط العلاقة ما بين أهل الأرض وأهل النيل، العلاقات المتشابكة ما بين العبودية ونسيان أهل النيل أثناء أزمات دارفور، وانتقام وعودة أهل دارفور للانتقام أثناء الحرب للأسف، وممارسات سيئة ضد أهل النيل. ده سؤال سعيد جدا يعني. الجزء الثاني محتاج أكتر نفهم يعني هل هو الفعالية الإمبريالية اللي بنقول عليها وسيطة حاليا أو قوة إقليمية، هل هي كانت قادرة على إسكات القوة الأسرة الديمقراطية اللي أنت تحدثت عليها العالمية؟ يعني القوة اللي فعلته الإمارات أو غيرها من الدول إسكات القوى الغربية عن الأزمة السودانية، وأيضا جزء من النهضة السودانية المدنية في دعمها مجرمين الحرب الآن، ده برضه كنا محتاجين نفهم. زي طبعا احنا مبسوطين وبنتابع دلوقتي ونتمنى ان احنا نشوفك. برضه في سؤال، هل في طبعا احنا محتاجين زي ما حضرتك قلتي ابحاث بشكل كبير تتكلم عن معاناه الانسان السوداني. بحس ان في مركزيه غربيه حول الحديث عن المشاكل والازمات الموجوده في شرق الصراع في الشرق الاوسط. يعني هل هناك تجهيل متعمد للحديث عن السودان؟ السودان قضيه منسيه بشكل كبير جدا، لا تلقى باهتمام، معذره طبعا بعيدا عن القضيه الفلسطينيه، حتى لا تلقى اهتمام مقارنه بالقضيه سواء السوريه او اللبنانيه. هناك تعمد واضح بشكل صريح وتجهيل معاناه الانسان السوداني الذي يعاني من معاناه لم نراها في اي قضيه اخرى او صراع. شكرا.
مساء الخير، صبير رمزي في الشارع السوداني. الحقيقه انا سعدت بالعرض بتاعكم جدا، واتفق مع القياده الرئيسيه وقانونها ان هي دي ثوره مضاده للثوره السودانيه. بس عندي يعني تعليق بسيط. هو اما ابتدينا البرزنتيشن اللي احنا بنعمل الفاندمنتالز بتاعت السودانيه وازاي البعد التاريخي يؤثر على الصراع، انا كنت متوقع ان بعد كده هسمع انعكاس ده على المشهد الحالي. ازاي الثوره المضاده هي بتعبر بشكل او باخر عن الخلافات الرئيسيه الموجوده في التاريخ السوداني. يعني كنت محتاج اسمع دول المركز، وازاي دول او المجموعات القبليه المحسوبه على الخرطوم وعلى نهر النيل والولايه الشماليه بتسيطر على السودان. وهذا فعلا يعني بعض حتى القوه المعارضه للقوات المسلحه السودانيه بتدعي ان هي بتعبر عن مظلوميه الهامش. فهل ده صحيح؟ احنا بصدد فعلا نوقف ما بين المركز، بين نخب المركز وبين نخب الهامش. التحالفات السياسيه الاخيره اللي حصلت بين عبد العزيز الحلو وحميدتي، هل هي بتعبر بشكل او باخر عن ده، ولا هي مجرد يعني خطاب ايديولوجي في الحال اللي هم فيه برروا صراعهم حوالين المسألة؟ المسألة الثانية برضه عايز افهم الانعكاس ده على العلاقات العسكرية المدنية. عفوا، ازاي ممكن مدخل العسكرية المدنية يفسر الثورة المضادة ودور النخب الإسلامية في السودان في يعني استخدام مؤسسات الدولة في الدفاع عن مصالحهم، التضحية حتى بالعاصمة والتضحية يعني بعشرات الآلاف من المصابين والضحايا وملايين المسيحيين. كنت عايز افهم يعني ليه المجتمع الدولي برضه بشكل اخر نجح في 19 ان هو يعمل توافق ما بين النقابه العسكريه والمدنيه في السودان وشكل حكومه انتقاليه. ودي نفس المجتمع الدولي، نفس الاطراف اللي اشتغلت على التوافق ما نجحتش في 21 وما نجحتش في 23 وما نجحتش لحد دلوقتي ان هي توافق ما بين النقابه العسكريه والمدنيه في السودان وبين النقابه العسكريه في السودان. شكرا.
Thank you so much. And I really praise your courage and your own personal resistance, like the three of you. And I really think that if Sudan needs something right now, it needs individuals like you. So my question is, we all understand, and when I say we, I mean those who work with local communities, we really understand the importance of international aid, and I think in Mizan's presentation this was reflected in a very clear way. But at the same time, we understand that international aid is a matter of question in so many cases, particularly in complex cases where accountability is lower than usual. So my question is, how do you think we can get out of this dilemma, international aid or international interference? Or even the question maybe, can we get out of this dilemma?
معنا كثير وقت.
طيب انا حابب عايز moment onto one another and say هو القرن 19 هو سبب sorry I'm switching now let me go back to English with the translators but that the 19th century is the reason for why we have this conflict in Sudan today. But I do think some of the material realities and the geographies that encompass the 19th century in Sudan, which I think really centers the stage for understanding Sudan's integration into the world system and help us I think sort of trace out the materiality of Sudanese history and think through it critically. So when I think about the relationship between the historical legacy of slavery in Sudan to the present moment, I think about slavery being tied to just the corporatization of capital accumulation in the 19th century in Sudan. Because with the Ottoman Egyptian expansion in Sudan in 1821, as I said earlier, Mohammed Ali Bashi came into Sudan looking for a very particular set of resources. But of course, you couldn't do this alone. You needed to co-opt a Sudanese bourgeoisie, a merchant class that had already broken off from the French Sultanate that was in Central Sudan through its enmeshment in global trading routes. So the Ottoman Egyptian government co-opted this group into them, co-opted this group into the spoils of their government, and in doing so, instituted a private property regime, a tax regime that sort of sedimented their power in Sudan through the control of the land. What this did was it ultimately, it's not to say that there was this direct binary between communal and private land had never existed before, but it pushed out a lot of merchants who had existed on communally shared land into the southern and the western frontier of slavery in Sudan. And this was one of the most lucrative, trading enterprises in the region, in Sudan in particular. And so this became a means by which, this lower class bourgeoisie compared to the landowning was able to then compete for power as well. And so, I mentioned earlier Azubair Pasha, who was one of these merchants who, had to leave Central Khartoum, went to the southern frontier and helped build up what later became a corporation. You could call it a Zariba in the 1870s that was built off of, him accumulating more and more enslaved people that he was able to then militarize and which he used to protect his access trading routes. And this became particularly important as the British and the Ottoman Egyptians tried to use different tax regimes or tried to use different tax laws to cut off the trade of enslaved peoples along the White Nile. And I also want to focus on slavery because I think this instance of this competition over slavery, as I said earlier, is really a competition over the monopoly over land, violence, and labor, and all of these sort of come into Sudan. And I would argue that this is something that has persisted in Sudanese history, although of course it's transmuted over time. And I really think it's important for us to incorporate race as an analytic, as a technology of difference that's utilized in Sudan and that comes with its own historical contingencies. In the 19th century, we can say that this was part of a trans-Saharan world of slavery and the symbols and signifiers of it. Now that has changed, and Arabness and blackness and how these things are deployed, especially as they come to the modern Sudanese state, have also evolved. But I do think grounding it in slavery allows us to ground it in a Sudanese history that's at once both particular and universal. Yeah, so that was my very brief answer.
أنا برضه هحاول أمر على الأسئلة السريعة. بالنسبة للسؤال حول هل القوى الوسيطة كانت قادرة على إسقاط القوى الغربية في الواقع السوداني كده؟ في جوانب متعارضة في بعض الأحيان. يعني في مثلا نموذج من اجتماعات مجلس الأمن في أكتوبر 2023 بريطانيا مع دول افريقيه ثانيه بدأوا يتكلموا عن الدور بتاع الخبيث اللي بتلعبه دوله الامارات في السودان وعن دعمهم لقوات الدعم السريع وغيره. بالمقابل الامارات قاطعت كل الاجتماعات المنظمه بريطانيا وارسلت رسائل واضحه انه اذا بريطانيا وصلت في انها تدخل في مجتمع الامارات مباشره بريطانيا تراجعت عن الدور اللي بتعمله وتناقشت مع القاده الافارقه في انه ما حنتكلم عن دور الامارات مره ثانيه. فده نموذج من انه كيف واضح انه الصراعات الجيوسياسيه المختلفه بتلعب دور في انها كيف في قوى وسيطه بتقدر تخضع قوى غربيه. لكن برضه الحاجه النهارده اللي عايز اقولها انه انا ما مقتنع بانه كان في جهود حقيقيه من القوى الغربيه الديمقراطيه الانسان والحاجات دي لانها تخضع القوى الوسيطه دي للرقابه والمحاسبه لانها تعمل جهود حقيقيه لحل السودان. ما افتكر كانت جهود حقيقيه عشان تجد مقاومه من القوى الوسيطه المختلفه. اما بالنسبه لدور القوى الوسيطه والسيطره على النسبه السودانيه المختلفه وكده في دور كبير جدا. الامارات تحديدا مثلا بتصرف اموال طائله في محاوله اختراق اي مجموعه مدنيه بتظهر في السودان ونجحت في كثير من الاحوال انها تصل للاهداف دي وتعمل عملاء مدنيين غير العملاء العسكريين زي قوات الدعم السريع في الخارطه السودانيه. وفي مشكله كبيره في الجانب ده. بالنسبه لانعكاس التاريخ السوداني على الواقع اليوم وهل مثلا الاستراتيجيات اللي بتحاول تدعيها الدعم السريع بانه دي حرب الهامش او المركز وإعادة توزيع السلطه والثروه وكده، طبعا لسه فرضيه خاطئه تماما رغم انها هي بتستند لواقع تاريخي حقيقي انه في تهميش لاماكن السودان بدرجه عاليه. في نموذج بتاع تنميه مركزي اللي تكلمت عنه جزء مؤخرا، لكن هو الدعم السريع باي حال من الاحوال ما ممكن تمثل الاستراتيجيه دي وتلعب الدور بتاع اعاده التوزيع ده، بالذات انه الضحايا الاوائل لقوات الدعم السريع تاريخيا واليوم هم اهل المناطق دارفور قبل فالاستراتيجيه دي ما عندها اي حقيقه فيها. بالنسبه للقصه بتاعت العلاقات المدنيه العسكريه ودور الاسلاميين ودور النخبه الاسلاميه تحديدا، طبعا في سرديات برضو انا ما هدخل في مدى صحتها ومدى خطأها لانه يعني حتى يعني ما في وضوح في الحقيقه شنو بالضبط او محتاجين تحاليل ودراسات اكثر. لكن في سرديه مثلا في ناس بتحاول يتكلموا عن انه الاسلاميين هم اشعال الحرب وكده، لكن دي ما الحقيقه كامله في حقائق كثيره في الحته دي. لكن الواضح والمؤكد انه بعد الحرب بدات كده انه القاده الاسلاميين مباشره وبتكرار بيقولوا بوسائل مختلفه انه في الحرب القائمه هي وسيلتهم للعوده او فرصتهم الاخيره للعوده للسلطه مره اخرى. فده بيخلي انه عندهم مصلحه مشتركه مع الجيش السوداني في انه يحاولوا يقووا العلاقه دي عشان يعودوا للسلطه مره اخرى. ودي العلاقه الدينيه العسكريه اللي احنا شايفينها بين الجيش والنخب الاسلاميه. بالنسبه للمجتمع الدولي كيف انه قدر يوفق بين الاسلاميين والعسكريين في 2019 وما قادر يعمل حل في الوضع الحالي كده. الاتفاقيه تم التوافق عليها في 2019 هي سبب كبير من الاسباب. يعني احنا هنا ليه؟ خاصه السلطه مع الجيش او مع المؤسسه العسكريه ومع قوات الدعم السريع هو سبب اساسي من الاسباب الحرب. من الاول ما بفتكر انهم هم نجحوا في خط التوافق في 2019. هم نجحوا في انه يمشوا اجنده مقابل تجديد اجنده ثانيه وعشان كده for the last question about the importance of international aid and how do we manage the question of accountability and also problematic aspects of national aid and so on. I think with the mutual aid groups on the ground, and maybe we can speak more to that, we're working on developing a decolonized model that centers the people, but also looks at accountability in a different way, where they're accountable to the communities they serve, not to the international aid organizations that they're working with or collaborating with. And in many ways, this was working. I think very ironically, I never thought I would base these efforts, but USAID was doing a lot to kind of remove some of these bureaucracies and figure out how to work with these local groups. It was not perfect and won't closely different, but there was some progress going there and looking at how do we do aid in a different way. That experience was quite short, but I think still groups on the ground are working on getting this decolonized model of humanitarian.
Done. Just quickly, 3 minutes.
Yeah, I know we have like a minute or less. يعني من حسن حظي إنه الزملاء جاوبوا على معظم الأسئلة، فبس حأضيف إضافة عامة maybe على نقطتين، اللي هو النقطة بتاعت إنه سؤال القضية المنسية التي لا تلقى اهتمام رغم إنه في معاناة لم نرى يعني لها سابق، والنقطة بتاعت هل دي حرب مركز وهامش حقيقة. أول حاجة دي معاناة رأينا لها سوابق كثيرة جدا داخل السودان وبيد الدعم السريع والجيش السوداني لسنوات طويلة جدا. وزي ما حاليا القضية بتاعت القصة بتاعت السودان ما لاقية مساحة، القصة بتاعت أو حاليا بمعنى أصح قصة الخرطوم أو قصة الأربن سنترز، قصة المراكز المدنية ما لاقية مساحة في السودان، في قصة بقية السودان اللي هي ما لقت مساحة كما هو واضح داخل السودان، ولا لقت مساحة حاليا في السرد التاريخي لما يحدث، بل بيحصل لها شكل بتاع اختفاء لما نتخيل إنه ما يحدث الآن في الحرب اللي بدأت من 23 هو شيء جديد لم نرى سابق له. وأكيد يعني معذورين الناس جميعا نتيجة لأنه حصل عملية بتاعت إخفاء حقيقية وعملية بتاعت تطبيع مع الحرب في هوامش السودان. ده بيودينا لانه حقيقه ايوه في ازمه ما بين فرق التنميه ما بين المركز والهامش، مستوى الحقوق ما بين المركز والهامش، مستوى التعرض للعنف ما بين المركز والهامش. اللي حصل في الحرب دي انه مستوى التعرض للعنف اللي كان مطبع للهامش جاء الى المراكز الحضريه. لما بتحكى القصه كما يحكيها يعني اصوات المناطق الحضريه على انها معاناه جديده، ده بيؤدي لانه نحن بنفقد جزء كبير من الجماهير السودانيه اللي من حقها ان قصتها تحكى، واللي هي جزء اساسي من القوه بتاعت الحراك، وجزء اساسي من قوه السرديه لما السرديه تكون متكامله. عشان كده بعتقد بالاضافه للعنصريه وكل ما سبق ذكره، كونه انه السرديه غير متكامله، وانه نحن حاليا بنحكي سرديه طبقه وسطى متعاميه عن معاناه سابقه لمعاناتها، بيؤدي لانه القضيه it doesn't ring. It doesn't ring. It doesn't resonate. You will not. يعني دي يعني القصة غير متكاملة، فيها تناقضات داخلية كثيرة، وده جزء كبير من السبب اللي يخلينا بننساها. قضية فرق الخدمات وفرق توزيع الثروة والسلطة ما بين المركز والهامش هي قضية حقيقية جدا، كما هي قضية كرامة السودانيين قضية حقيقية جدا. لكن لا خطاب الدعم السريع عن إنه هو جاي لحرب الهامش ضد المركز حقيقي، ولا خطاب الجيش عن إنه هو في حرب كرامة حقيقي. الحاجة دي مثل ما بتثبت بتصرفاتهم تجاه السودانيين التي يعني لا تحفظ كرامة ولا جابت للهامش أي تطور، لكن برضو واضحة في شكل تحالفاتهم، سواء مثلا استمرار علاقات اقتصادية ما بين الجيش والإمارات حفاظا على المصالح الاقتصادية للنخبة بغض النظر عن البروباغندا بتاعت قطع العلاقات وغيره، او لما نرى في حلف الدعم السريع اللي هو ايوه بيعلوا فيه اسم الجهات من دارفور والنوبة حميتي والحلو وما إلى ذلك، لكن في الحقيقة هو برضه فيه الحزب الاتحادي الديمقراطي ممثلا، يعني فيه اللي هو يعني نخبة النخبة، مركز المركز الشمالي، ومن الأحزاب المسيطرة على السياسة في السودان منذ قبل استقلالها. فده بيوضح إنه في الجهتين موضوع الكرامة وموضوع الهامش والمركز هم أقوال حق أريد بها باطل. That's all. Thank you very much.
Just for